Okay, so I'm here with a new friend of mine, Oliver Perrin. I thought we would have an interesting discussion on the subject of human farming, which we're going to get into through this. But I would like Oliver to introduce himself and give us some background in terms of his life and what interested him about this specific discussion we're going to have. Oliver, over to you.
Yes, sir. Well, first off, it's a great opportunity to speak with you. Thank you for taking the time. Here we are speaking across thousands of miles with the miracle of digital communications. As far as what would lead me to be interested in the topic that you are about to introduce, advertising in part. And all of this is going to be kind of a reveal since you haven't announced what the subject is. So we'll leave it to the viewers to relate what I'm discussing now to the theme that you're about to introduce. But I worked in advertising for quite some time. I still do at a strategic level for some projects, which is to say I'm not so much doing design, but I work with clients who want to figure out how to make their ideas sticky or compelling, to have a resonance with the audience that they're trying to reach. So it's another flavor of Death Star, Darth Vader shit, ultimately. But I have had an interest over many, many years in marking, in how and why human beings mark things, where that behavior comes from, and how we can trace its outlines across, the variety of world cultures. And I think when we turn to the subject you will shortly introduce, that the potential connections between that subject and my background will become more apparent. But otherwise, I'm just a guy who spent some time in advertising, got disgusted with it, and decided to try to blaze my own new path. As anyone who's seen my channel will be able to see, I have a breadth of interests that are reflected there. And before I turn it back over to you, I want to say to any of my viewers that are watching, I hope you will check out Michael's channel, which I've found very interesting. It seems that he has some of the same types of combinations, arrived at by a different path, but he shares my interest in some of the range of topics. So I hope you will all check his channel out and give it a try. I've enjoyed it.
Well, thank you very much for the kind words. As for myself, not quite such a similar background, interestingly enough, but very similar in terms of outlook. I think we approach it from very different perspectives, though. I started off as a former intel analyst for the British government. So when I retired and started looking at how deep the rabbit hole really went in terms of human behavior and where the human species was heading and how many, many things, certain government programs, certain types of advertising programs, a lot of the stuff that we're going to get into, how those connected in the sense of a broad overview, I began to see that there was much more to this than simply the individual strands that were coming off, as it were. So that's what sparked my interest. And then when I realized that things were quickly deteriorating in the realm of politics specifically, as well as psychologically for human beings, I thought, well, this is a point in time at which I have to start contributing something in order to pull us back from what appeared to me to be the brink of near extinction, to be perfectly frank. That's where I see us heading, and it's a dangerous path that we're heading down. So I thought it's important for as many people as possible to contribute to either preventing that or minimizing the effects of that on people who are interested in knowing how to do that. And this is one of the things that actually brought me to your channel in a sense, and I was very, very intrigued by this fact that many of the topics that you've touched on in your videos as well look at human behaviors, and your chats with Tim, of course, who has done some fantastic work in explaining many of these concepts and ideas. And I thought, this is great. This is exactly what the world needs. And there's so many other people doing the same thing as you and I. So it's good to have a broad mix. It's good to have a broad range of perspectives. And it gives you a lot of food for thought, I think. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
well, we all
So
have to bail together, right?
exactly, exactly. If the ship goes down, we either have to jump out of the Titanic or drown with it. You know.
Right. Or enjoy that last string quartet music, right?
Oh yeah, yeah, yeah. It's always women and children first, though, which is one
Right.
of the things that offends me. But hey,
Yeah,
each to their own.
The MGTOWs are pissed off, right?
Oh yeah, yeah, and it's understandable. I mean, there's so much we could just get into on that topic, man. My goodness, the gender disparity thing that's going on, that's a really big deal, and I've been trying to address that in my own way, trying to get to grips with exactly what is going on. I know Paul Elam is doing some really great work on that through an ear for men now, previously with a voice for men, on men's rights issues. I've recently been speaking to a couple of people in the men's pickup artistry sort of community as well, and they have some interesting perspectives. So it's a hodgepodge of different ideas. It's a very rich environment, I think, and a very healthy environment where ideas are being debated, particularly on YouTube, but other platforms as well. So that's a good thing. The only consternation I have with that is the level of censorship that YouTube as a corporation, as a company, is doing right now. That is a real big issue. Many content creators have addressed this. I know Styx has, Stefan Molyneux has, several other major players have done so as well. So it's on the one hand, it's a good time for people to be engaging with other people. On the other hand, the corporations are really trying to stop that happening. So this is where these kinds of chats really come into play, because they really do help to push the envelope, push the boundaries in terms of people's thinking and ideas and whatnot as well. So, yeah, yeah. But the central topic and the central theme of today, I think, would have to be this thing that we were sort of chatting about, which is human farming and how human beings are farmed on this planet as as livestock, essentially. You see, farmers farm crops and livestock, but from my observations, political power brokers farm human beings. And just as farmers maximize production of milk and meat, the powerful maximize their production of consumers and debt slaves, to put it in simple terms. And the goal seems to be, and I know I'm simplifying it terribly here, but the goal does seem to me to be to make man into an owned machine, a machine in essence that is there for the benefit of the ruling elite, as it were. And I think at this point in time, there is virtually no doubt that there is a ruling elite, or certainly a powerful class, who have amassed so much knowledge of human psychology and manipulation of human beings that they can really drive not only the media narratives forward, which I'll talk about a little bit as well, but also the political paradigms that are shaping as well. So people are right now getting separated into camps as a result of this. And this has been something that I've seen happen and I've read about quite extensively, happening through history. They've always subdued the unwashed masses, as it were, through psychological manipulation, hypnosis, advertising, dogma, superstitious beliefs, religions, artificial expectations which are placed on people. And it's turned human beings, as I say, into a sort of a financial crop. And the thing about money here, interestingly, because we're touching on finances here, see, money is just a representation of your energy and time. And the question I always ask people about this is, how are you spending your time and how are you spending your energy? What are you spending it on? And if it's the case that you're slaving away for your masters, as it were, well, then I would suggest you're not spending it wisely, right? If that's the only thing you're doing, if that's the sole focus or takes up the primary amount of time that you have, and time on this earth is limited, man, right? It's very limited. We're all going to die at some point, and it's always too damn short, right? Okay, so the person who's just gotten married, maybe has kids or whatever else, it's like, well, you want the time in that situation to raise your children. You don't know if you're going to get it, but that's what you're after, right? Is to spend as much time as possible doing that. Other people have other sorts of goals in life that they want to achieve, and even there, the time is limited. Look at Steve Jobs, for example. He knew that his time was limited from the get-go to some extent, but even that amount of time that he had was not quite enough. To found Apple and then to solidify his family life as well alongside that. And he died at a young age, or what we would consider to be a young age at this point, of only 55. It gives you a lot of, it gives you something to think about, really, I think.
Memento mori. Yes.
Exactly. And, the sad thing is that people are, or maybe it's just me, the fact that I'm so invested, in a sense, in the human species. There are a lot of people that are totally disassociated with whether or not the human species survives or not. And I can understand that to some degree. Because if you read the scientific literature on this, Ollie, there's this idea that we're headed for a sixth extinction anyway, and that's destined to happen. But be that as it may, I'm a member of the human species and I don't want to die out. I'll put it that simply. I don't want to die out yet, right? Maybe it's just my egotism, right? I've personally, through exploring Buddhism and whatnot, made a lot of peace with the idea that I'm going to die. I'm very comfortable with my own mortality. Whenever it comes, it could be 2 seconds while we're talking here. I might just,
heaven forfend.
Angels and ministers of grace defend us, Shakespeare. What were we saying there? I've completely lost it.
You were discussing human farming and how that fits into this larger background of potential extinction events and concern with our mortality. Yes.
Oh, now I remember. Yes. So a lot of people are dedicating their entire lives to the power brokers in society, in essence. And these are people who have, as I said before, amassed an immense amount of knowledge about the workings of the human being, right? So they can drive things whichever way they see fit. And in a strange sort of sense, because people like yourself and myself judging from our work, we're also acquainted with this to some degree, to a greater or lesser degree. And so, there's a responsibility on people like us to share that knowledge, I think. But those who have cloistered that knowledge, right, are driving people to dedicate their entire lives to these power brokers. That's part of the problem. People are worshipping them like gods. And this ties into another point that I made in a recent video, which is to do with the Roman Empire. You see, the Roman Empire was one of the first empires to perfect the slave-owning model, which eventually collapsed because they debased the currency so much and they had this expansionist agenda, and eventually they couldn't finance their entire empire and their objectives at the same time. But whilst it was existing, they used a myriad of various methods to keep their power. And in fact, in fear of an uprising, the Flavian Piso dynasty at the time created a new state-sanctioned religion, and that's what we know today as Christianity, in order to pacify the masses and make them a docile creature, as it were. So this was, in my mind at least, it seems to be the first attempt at making human beings into objects, into farmed things, into more productive, streamlined sort of factory machines, as it were. And I've seen as well that every totalitarian system since then has used exactly the same ideas. It's basically a mirror image, insofar as I can tell, of the Roman Empire, and that includes Soviet-era communism, right? And this brings me to another point, which is that communism, although it purports to be the antithesis of capitalism, and capitalism itself is not an actual economic model, and I've gone into that in some of my own videos, but communism is not, contrary to what people think, communism is not for delivering equality. If that was the case, every communist system that's ever been implemented would have had some method or form of equality in it. But we don't find that. What we find is the same schism in those societies where you have the ruling classes, the ruling elite, and then the serfs, the slaves, the ordinary, what they call in their system, according to Marx, the proletariat, who are doing all the hard work and farming themselves out, and their deaths don't matter, which is why communism collectively has led to the death of over 100 million people, right? But in today's society, we've kind of moved on from the old system of just merely state religion being the primary tool of manipulation. We've now got TV and radio and newspapers and even the internet, which is doing the evangelizing instead of religion. And we've still got these same sort of priest classes, and we've still got the slaves that are there, because if you look at the inception of the media stations, the media channels, the newspapers, they were always state sanctioned, right? It's always been a tool for mind control. To give a great example of this, the British Broadcasting Corporation here, the BBC in the UK, that was given royal assent. It was given a royal decree to broadcast to the nation. It was primarily initially and first used for royal broadcasts, to make sure that the people could relate to the royal family at the time, who were the ruling class. So media has never been divorced. And I think this is what people are starting to realize with all this talk about fake news and what have you. And it's not just the news channels, it's not just the news stations. There's stuff that relates to your particular field of advertising and Edward Bernays, which we can get into as well, and the psychological manipulation there. Color psychology and symbolism psychology. There's a whole myriad of things that really take off from that. But the media has always been a tool of mind control and obtaining the obedience, the silent obedience of the citizens, I think, from the get-go. This is not a new phenomenon. It's just that it used to be a little bit more scrupulous, and they had a sense of ethics at one point in time. I know a lot of people think maybe they didn't, but at a certain point, there were certain do's and don'ts. Those have now gone. Now what we were seeing, particularly in news outlets, is the complete fabrication of stories, which we'd never seen before the Iraq War, in my opinion. So, there's a lot of stuff going on there. And all of this collectively, the manipulation by these ruling elites, the banking mechanisms which exist, the political systems which exist, you name it, any sphere of human endeavor, has created this society where we're living in little boxes like animal pens, and you're told constantly what you can't do and what you can't say and what you must do and what you must say to get your supper. You're singing for your supper constantly. This is one of the great problems and the great sadnesses of this current age, is that there is such an era of censorship. And we were sort of talking about that just a little bit beforehand as well, where YouTube, for example, is censoring people to a great degree at the moment. And it's not just YouTube. I'm getting banned, for example, on shadow banned, I should say, on Twitter, which is happening. Right. Other platforms are doing the same thing. Facebook recently has been tampering with my posts. My internet connection is being constantly tampered with, probably because, and a lot of people have said this is a possibility. I'm not saying it's the case, but it is possible that that's because we're hitting a nerve with a lot of the work that we're doing out there. Those of us that are on the frontier, in a sense, exploring these strange ideas. But this might be what George Orwell was talking about, really, when he wrote Animal Farm, because I was rereading that recently. And it is certainly, I think, an essay, if you will, on the human condition and the dangers of communism. All animals are equal. Some animals are more equal than others and so forth. But more so, it could be that Orwell perhaps foresaw the fact that we would be farmed like animals. I think there might be a subconscious connotation there. I don't know. But maybe he just used it as an allegorical device in order to get his point across. But the thing that really, really irritates me about today's age is that most people are living in an invisible cage. They've, in a very real sense, given into the darker impulses of human nature, and they've invested their complete life energies into greed and envy and jealousy and a constant need to please people or to live up to expectations which are not their own. And this fascinates me. Why should you feel this urge to buy the latest gizmo or get a particular type of car and the lifestyle that is associated with that, just to play a game of one-upmanship with your neighbor, for example, or with somebody else who isn't even in your immediate vicinity, let's say George Clooney, right? Or maybe you want to live the lifestyle of George Clooney. But why? Who is George Clooney? What makes George Clooney any better than you or I, that we should wish to be associated with that? And this is where, again, the realm of advertising comes in, right? Because there are all sorts of methods that they use, jump cuts, for example, or reorienting your orientation waves in your brain by focusing on certain objects or subjects, depending on the camera angles and all the various scenery and the way in which the commercial is shot, the narration of that commercial, the hypnotic tools, the voices. All of this comes into play in terms of how people then become malleable to this form of control by corporations, by the state. And most corporations, this is another point I want to touch on very quickly. Most corporations are offshoots of the state. And by corporations, I'm not talking about two guys getting together and just building a company, a small business, as it were. Those exist. What we're really talking about are the oligarchies, the oligarchical corporate entities which exist. For example, Coca-Cola. Not a lot of people know that Coca-Cola is one of the only corporations or companies out there that has a license from the DEA, the Drug Enforcement Agency, to produce cocaine in one of its plants in New Jersey, I think it is. Right? And that's a very strange thing, that one company is given dispensation to do that while other citizens are not. There's a disparity there legally. You see, so you can't produce cocaine, and I don't think cocaine is a good drug in any way, shape, or form. I don't think people should overly experiment with it. But the fact that there is this legal disparity, the fact that there is this social disparity between those corporations which have the backing of the state, like Coca-Cola. And Coca-Cola, I guess it gets to go into all these countries that have been destabilized in the Middle East. They're the first ones selling soda out there, right? So there's a very distinct correlation between the actions of Coca-Cola and the state. But it's not just Coca-Cola. I'm just using that as one example, right? And there are a myriad of other corporations that do this as well. That cross borders and commit horrendous atrocities on behalf of the state. Coca-Cola did this also in South America. There's a myriad of things that they were responsible for in terms of human suffering that happened in that region. But to get back to the point I was making, these people that are looking to buy into the Coca-Cola lifestyle or the Pepsi lifestyle, be part of the Pepsi generation, or these ideas that they have that are given to them through advertising, they've produced a feeling of inadequacy, because you're always measuring yourself by a yardstick against what you perceive to be an astonishing sort of lifestyle that's associated with another person. You know? And that's a false expectation, because they don't have that life. That's just your perception of what they are living as, right? Maybe George Clooney's life isn't fantastic. Maybe he argues every day with his wife before he goes out the house, right? Maybe his pig loves him more than his wife does. I don't know, right? But, excuse me, but the point being that in that situation, the fact that individuals are being manipulated on a grand scale to buy into to adopt the frame, as it were, of the corporations through these advertising mechanisms, which you'll be able to speak far more about, is unhealthy at best, because you can never be wealthy enough, you can never be beautiful enough, you can never be successful enough you know? And all these people are trying to sell you a future, or at least an ideal, an imagined future, if you will, which is never going to materialize because it's not possible in your particular situation, right? So you've got these oligarchies who are buying futures, selling futures, when in point of fact, you as an individual have no future. That's the scary thing, man, right? That people are buying into false realities. Because at that point in time, doing that, it makes them more susceptible to not only becoming solipsists, but living in an unreal space in their heads. And that's self-destructive because you start cloistering yourself off from the greater population. And I think that's what we're seeing to a great extent as well. But it also comes with a burden, all of this. It's pervasive. You end up, I think, with a dark force that haunts you psychologically. Your subconscious starts really eating at you. And the demons that people have start wrestling with the better angels of their nature. They tie themselves up in knots, forever trying to become, if you will. And they also start feeling oppressed. And this is where the politics of it, I think, ties in. Because along come ideologues that convince them that the source of their troubles rests with one particular group or another particular group, and you get this engineered conflict. But everywhere you look today, see, here's the lie that's sold, and I was talking about this as well on my channel, is everyone is looking to oppress someone else. Okay, everyone's looking to oppress another individual if it's in their ability to do so that they can feel better about their own failings as a human being. And meanwhile, while all of this stuff is going on, and God knows we've probably covered a myriad of bases, which again sprawl off into different ideas, right, and different subject matters, but the architects of our doom exist above it all, right? They exist beyond it. And nobody sees it. Nobody sees it. Like, how many people do you know, for example, right, that buy into the religion of money? They think money is a real thing. When they see that dollar bill, they believe it to be 100% real, or that pound note or whatever else it is. They believe it is real. They don't realize that it's an imagined concept. It's completely made up out of thin air. And there's nothing backing that currency whatsoever. Central banks created it out of thin air. Now, more and more people are waking up to this fact, which is great. But at the same time, and I talk about this as well, is that in a very real sense, the majority of the population does not know these things, or will refuse to accept them point blank, even if they're presented with facts upon facts about how debt creation happens. That every time the bank creates money, there's a debt that accompanies that, which is then passed on to the citizens of that country. Now, they don't know how those mechanisms work intricately, right? They don't realize that debt is taken out in their name as individuals and then sold on the stock market as derivatives and everything else that comes into the mix. It's a very, very complicated subject area, and it's one that I'll probably be exploring in more depth again, probably on my own channel. But again, the point being that this imagined reality that we're all living in. I mean, there was a time, this is the example I like to use, right, is Pepsi, right? And I said this to a friend of mine recently. I said, if I was to place a bottle of Pepsi in front of you, and God knows I'm probably actually doing their work for them. More people are going to go and buy Pepsi and Coke as a result of us kind of advertising it here, right? But if I was to stick a bottle of Pepsi in front of someone and I was to say to them, look, do you know there was a time when Pepsi did not exist? They would look at me like I was out of my fucking mind. Right? They would look at me like I've lost my marbles. They'd say to me, what are you talking about? Pepsi's always been there. It's been there since the day that I was born. And that's true for most people. Pepsi has been there since day one for them, because since they're born, because of the way that our memories are formed, right, and because of the way that we think unidimensionally, it's not possible for people to in many cases, to think previous to that. It's a little bit like when kids ask their parents, they can't believe when their parents tell them about their childhood or their younger years. They say there was never a time when you were old, Mum and dad were always just mum and dad with old grey hair and whatever else, right? So it's almost a disability, if you like, that we human beings have, is an inability to comprehend what came before. Because we can only deal with what is directly in front of us. So that Pepsi example, right, is a great way of illustrating the fact that we have trouble conceptualizing or conceiving of the fact that something could be entirely made up and yet seem completely real to us, like money. Money in Pepsi is no different. There was a time when money didn't exist. We made do without it. We went for, if one goes with the evolutionary biological theory, then for about 250,000 years, we were okay without money. Something happened in that time, right? Something happened very recently in human history that made us think that we needed money to live. What was that thing? Was it industrialization? Yeah, okay. Well, what else accompanies that? The fact that there was a complete architecture in place when industrialization came in, industrial farming. There's a whole myriad of stuff that comes into this. Sorry, man, I've kind of been rambling here, but there's a whole myriad of things that I'd love to hear your thoughts on this. Please come in and we'll.
Okay, well, the first one I want to dart in with is relative to Coca-Cola. And I don't want to go far with it, but I've worked for them on a number of occasions, both in the U.S., in the United Arab Emirates, and in Bangkok, on some of their various beverage programs. In the sense of usually marketing or new product development innovation. And I don't believe that Coca-Cola is today involved in producing beverages that include cocaine. That's not to dispute it with you. I'll have to go take a look, but I do want to point out that in the past, of course, they did include cocaine as a part of their formula, and that is, as many people don't know, all of that came out as a part of the what we could call the pre-prohibition movement. What used to happen was that in order for a beverage to have any hope of lasting on the shelf, it had to be fermented, have some alcohol in it, therefore it would keep. So, during the day or in the afternoon or with lunch or just to have something to drink, you'd have wine. Perhaps it would be watered, right? As the ancient Greeks and Romans thought, if you drank straight wine, not tempered with water, you might go mad. But in any case, you'd have things like what we would call today hard cider would have just been cider, because the alcohol was what allowed it to be stable. But what happened is these people came along in the U.S., primarily pharmacists, in the late 1800s, and they began to, as chemists, as pharmacists, create beverages that didn't have to have the alcohol content. Sugar also helps to preserve things. And they experimented with all kinds of different ingredients that went into their beverages. And it all comes out of the pharmacists. And they compounded these beverages artificially, which is why you get things like Dr. Pepper, right? The great pharmacist who created this thing, and they bring in carbonation and the rest. But not to get lost down that winding hole, to come back around to the idea of men, of human beings more properly, as willing slaves, and their farming, their keeping as a kind of livestock. I approached that subject a little bit differently than you have. I had a friend who was collecting antique weapons, particularly weapons from the Islamic world, Persian steel, weapons from the south of Russia, weapons from Anatolia, the Caucasus in particular. And one day I was visiting him, and he had an absolutely fantastic collection of antique weapons. And I was having a cigarette on his balcony, and he carried out this 18th century Circassian helmet. And it's, a little disc with a male coif that comes down and beautiful niello work. And as I'm looking at it, I see on a little medallion that there's this tiny little emblem. And I said, what the hell is that? And he said, oh, that's called a tamga. And I said, oh, a tamga. What the hell's that? He's like, it's a clan sign. It's a tribal sign. He also happened to have a Quebecois flag, or a flag of Quebec, just for the hell of it, flying there on a little post on his terrace or balcony. And so I'm looking at this little sign on the helmet. Then I look up at the flag of Quebec with the fleur-de-lis on it. And then I think about my own background in branding and advertising. And I said, wait a minute, there's this one central theme, which is that, you know, this mark has this helmet has a mark, which is a clan sign. Here's a flag with the fleur-de-lis, and it's, you know, signifies dominion over a geographic area. It's the flag around which soldiers will rally. They'll fight and die for it. And then there are these brands, these brand marks that get used by corporations to stimulate and integrate consumer behavior. And I said, So as is my wont, I dug into the etymology. And linguists would argue with me, some of them. They would call what I do folk etymology. But they can fuck themselves, as far as I'm concerned. The roots of this word tamga, I found winding all through a number of currents, and I'll skip going down any number of them and just stick with sort of the core. There are, in Latin, there is dam, and that leads to deem and doom. But in ancient Greek, there's damazo, and it is to tame. And you find it in Persian, and you find it in Prakrits and a number of Indian languages going back quite far. You have this idea of placing a mark on a thing and taming it, and of the thing that bears the mark as having been tamed. And I mean, you discussed this idea of media. And it turns out that in the ancient world, the various mediums were themselves marked. Skins and hides were the primary form of currency very early on. We have a vestige of it in the US where we still say $1 is a buck, meaning a buck's skin. We can see with the Uluburun shipwreck off the coast of Turkey, where they pulled up all this ancient stuff. They have ingots of copper and tin, which are formed in the shape of an ox hide. Now, the archaeologists argue about this. Was it really intended to look like an ox hide, or was it because it was easier to carry with these sort of handles projecting? I believe that they were actually intended to be ox hides, based on the principle from material culture that a new innovation will typically take the form of some previous thing, even if it doesn't have to, because conceptually it needs to resemble that thing. But my point is that even these things were marked. The so-called ox hide ingots of copper and tin from the Uluburun shipwreck have these marks on them that are very similar to tamga marks. But if we imagine that there was a predecessor to these things that was on skins, that they're imitating the former version, then it would have simply been the brand mark that would have been on the skin of the livestock that was slaughtered, and then the skin was used as currency. So as soon as you begin to look at it like that, you see this sort of rich world unfold. You've got metals, early metals, which are imitating skins that themselves had brand marks. And then you have this idea that precious metals can become smaller units as a currency that will then bear the mark or stamp of their owner. And as currency, they would literally be a medium that would allow for the propagation of images, because they would circulate and each would see that mark, which would extend the fame, the fama, the knowledge on the part of the public or the people of the importance of the person who controlled the currency. Often it would be a king, or you'd have the mark of a god. That wherever the power lies, you will find the ability to make the marks. And you will find that ability very jealously guarded. In the ancient world, the temples were essentially banks. It's still the case today in India, where Modi is desperately trying to get the temples to turn off of all the gold they have socked up away in there. And
That's right. Yeah.
I enjoy watching that, because the last thing you're going to do is peel gold out of a Brahmin's hands. You're good luck trying to take all the gold out of the basement of Ganesha's temple, or Lakshmi, right? And Lakshmi goes with this idea of Lakshana, which is a Prakrit. It's an old word that has to do with an auspicious marking. And Lakshmi is often shown with these coins with their auspicious markings, because the temples are tied to this. Again, when the ancient Greeks wanted to find out something from the Oracle of Delphi, they would head up to Delphi and they would bring a huge set of gifts of gold that would be kept in the temples. And in Herodotus, you can read that these things were things that were never supposed to be moved. The greatest evil would be if someone tried to come and empty out the temples. It was sacrilege, because the priests and priesthood were supposed to have control of this. Later, it was extended to the state outside of the religious context, but they still controlled coining, minting, right? So you see the marks appearing on skins of livestock. You see the skins of livestock getting carried over as a symbol of value based on its shape to these oxhide ingots. Then you see these marks being carried over onto coins, which are a currency. But we should take a look at also the marking of slaves. And one of my favorite is that often people consigned to slavery as a punishment in the ancient Roman world were sent off to the mines. But one of the tattoos that they would often be given, in this case it would be cut into their forehead, seldom branded, most often cut into the forehead, and then you would have charcoal or ink or whatever rubbed into the cut, but they would mark on their forehead D-A-M, which meant damnato ad metallum, which means damned or consigned to the mines. But now look at that word I just used to define damn. Consign. Consignum. A judgment rendered on a person. And the word we use means consignum, with a mark. The putting of the mark is the judgment, which is why we see damn is deem, which is to judge, which is doom, which is to execute that judgment. So etymology kind of shows us how the placing of a mark on a thing is this sign of executive power. But we can take it further back in time, which is my interest. As I said, I'm interested in marks and signs. So I kept digging into ancient history and where these marks appeared. I'm looking at Thracian tattoos. I'm looking at, Roman punitive measures with their slaves. And I keep digging further and further back. And I say, wait a minute. Animals place marks on their environment as territorial marks. They'll mark the borders of their territory. Now, they might do it like dogs do, pissing on a tree, right? And this is where we get this idea of a totem pole. The larger the dog is, the higher up its genitals are off the ground, which means the higher the stream of urine hits the thing it's peeing on, the taller it is. A smaller animal tries to mark that same thing. Any animal coming up will smell up to the bottom. Okay, there's the first animal. Oh, there's the next one. It's taller. Oh, here's the dominant one that's highest up on the pole. But they don't just use olfactory marks. They use visible marks. So you'll see cats tearing up the edge of trees, but they also have scent in their paws. So it's a combination of a visible and olfactory mark. And they will often mark food caches. Wolves will bury food, but mark it with their urine to dig it up later. Pandas will actually do a handstand. They've been videotaped doing this. Do a handstand to be able to pee as high as possible and trick those in their environment to seem by seeming to be larger than they actually are. So you get into scent communication. Scent communication overlaps with visual or visible communication among the higher mammals. And so we see how animals use these markings. So imagine human beings in a time before language, because I guarantee you the linguists would be ashamed to even admit the idea to consideration. There was a time before we had a language. There's just no way around it. And
Can I just add something to that, just very quickly? It's just because of the nature of what you're saying is 100% correct. I couldn't agree with you more. Helen Keller. I'm sure you're familiar with Helen Keller, and she was a woman who was mute, I believe, and deaf and blind, or
All
a
of the
combination
above.
of those.
Well,
All
I
of the
believe
above.
she eventually learned how to speak after a fashion, but she was blind and deaf.
Yes. But she was able to conceptualize the idea of water, for example, through mere touch and many other things. She knew what they were. She could conceptualize them. She could form an image of that, map that image, if you like, to her brain without the ability to speak or without the ability to communicate. So this is why I think it adds credence to your idea here. That there, even before language existed, there must have been some method to communicate ideas.
Absolutely. And more importantly, to establish control of territory for the resources that exist within it. And at the time before we knew how to speak, we did have teachers. And those teachers would have been the animals that existed, in particular the higher mammals that were in our environment. So you see many things like, the idea of Romulus and Remus being raised by a wolf. Now, Tim has pointed out that very likely goes back to a tradition of, if I'm not mistaken, a whore in Rome who was known as the wolf, who took in these two orphans. And it is said that once upon a time you could still see the wolf's house. But this idea of wolves raising a person, symbolically shown with the wolf with teats suckling Romulus and Remus, it goes back further. The Turks have these same kind of ideas. And totemism and its global distribution in one form or another shows us that we learn from animals. And higher mammals use territorial marks. So before there was any school and before there was any language, I believe people were using marks, which has some interesting implications to consider, foremost among them the idea that we had writing after a fashion before we ever had speech. And this kind of fucks with the general linguistic definition of writing, which is generally considered to be an accident of speech. And writing properly defined is considered to be a thing that represents speech, which I think is a bunch of horseshit, which is why I generally don't get along with most linguists, except for integrational linguists. Anyway, the point that I'm getting at is that marks were the original tool for organizing human behavior. Now look at global brands today. They operate across linguistic and cultural borders, and they tend to move from a written sign to one that is more and more iconic. And so in the case of Nike, it used to say Nike, and then there would be that little winged sandal swoosh, right? But over time, they've dropped those elements, and it's become just the symbol. You can see it with Starbucks as well. It's no longer necessary to write Starbucks. Now, they'll do it, but very often it's enough to have the mark itself, the little mermaid figure. And as soon as it goes international, you find that that's great because there's no need to know the linguistic value of what you're looking at. Or if you have a country that uses the Hangul writing system or kanji, right, in East Asia, or the various scripts that come off the old Brahmi and Karasotri, or Devanagari, I think it's called, some of the Indian scripts. You don't have to worry about any of that. You just put the mark up, and guess what? Everybody gets it. That mark signifies territory and dominion, and by extension, a conceptual area. Now, look over at your idea of fiat currency. As you pointed out, it has no fucking value. It has whatever value it does have, illusory, through fiat. The government says, we say it's worth this. But what are we really dealing with? The paper is just a carrier for a mark. And that mark indicates a conceptual category, an abstraction. So let's back up. We know that we have brands on animals. We know that ownership of livestock is one of the oldest sort of metaphors. It's sort of the origin of farming. My belief is that we had livestock raising long before we ever had farming. Now people will say, no, it took time to domesticate those animals. And I say, kiss my ass, because the reality is that you don't have to have a domesticated animal to derive your sustenance from herds. So in the Upper European Paleolithic, you could say, well, they couldn't have at that point domesticated aurochs and all these other things. Yeah, but they could have, and we in fact have evidence that they did follow those herds that were not domesticated and pick off the ones on the edges and live from them. And they tended in different regions to derive their sustenance from specific herds. So red deer in one area, right? Or caribou in another. And they become totemic. And you begin to see how those animals in their category can be distinguished based upon the sort of silhouette of their horns, of their shape. And we see on early petroglyphs, which are marks made on rocks to indicate territorial claims, just like an animal territorial mark, we see these figures of different horn patterns and head shapes of these different animals. So we know that with the herd, we have the first opportunity for category and instance. We know that this shape of the head indicates a particular type of animal, not to mention its coloring on its skin. And so we say, well, the skin itself has a certain look which distinguishes the one animal from the other, but in general, they are a category. And so we have category and instance. And category and instance precede numeracy, which is the ability to reckon in units. So there's a fundamental thing about human control, human resource hoarding, and sustenance growth that goes back to these ideas of herds. And we see it reflected in early terminology. Like I've been going through the Iliad trying to find all instances of where a commander is referred to like a shepherd or someone who drives cattle, and the troops are referred to like livestock. And it's endless. There are any number of them. And we see also, the idea in the Abrahamic religions of the shepherd and his flock. Now, that brings us, because I don't want to wind on, I want to give you an opportunity to participate here as well. This winds us around to our fundamental ideas of wealth and value. And I split them down 3 lines. There's cattle, chattel, capital. And all of those 3 terms come from head count, capital. And our idea that you have a head count of cattle and that you count them, but you count them based on category and instance. And these things determine your wealth. So the idea is fundamentally that the wealth of these elites that you refer to is comprised, or rather the human beings themselves counted by head. Right? And you notice here that you don't have individual distinctions of any importance. They are rendered sort of interchangeable. One can just as easily work as another because individuality, again, does not matter. This is our herd. They are our milk cows. They are cattle. They are chattel. And therefore, they are our capital. This is a fundamental basis of power and control. The last thing I'll add in there is that this only happens when people are willing slaves, as you opened with. I want to bring this back around and establish a ligature so I'm not just drifting all over the place. And I think the important thing there is a separate tradition of discussing slavery, and that is the philosophical traditions. I believe you can go all the way back to Diogenes Kunikos, Diogenes the cynic, right? Who just dumped everything and lived in total poverty because he did not want to be trapped and constrained by his possessions or circumstances. And you see this get carried forward in a number of different currents, a number of different ways, all the way on up to a great figure like Epictetus. And his name itself means acquired. He was a slave who became a freedman. And he refers at every opportunity to those who are bound by concern for things that they do not control as slaves. And his fundamental thing was that any person who wants to cleave to reason must recognize that life is not within their control. Love is not within their control. Wealth, status, standing, any of these things. The sole thing that lies within the realm of true control of the individual is their actions. And to be concerned or to even pursue without moderation these other areas beyond the reasoned control of one's actions means that you are confused about what is yours and what is not. And at that point, you've been moved off your center. You are easily manipulable. And at that point, I move to the Christian idea that's long forgotten, though Christians would profit from considering it, which is the idea that the sin itself, the condition of sin itself, is its punishment. And that's what a lot of people don't understand about, like Dante's Commedia. So I want to use this image for those who do not control their own passions. Dante's going down through the different levels of the Inferno, and he stops in this area that's like a black space, and there are these wild winds blowing in the blackness. And these two young lovers who were known in Dante's time for having had an unsanctioned love affair and had been killed by their families, Paolo and Francesca, they're being blown around in this black night. That's how Dante shows us that the condition of sin itself, in the Christian framework, is its punishment. You're not looking at what they got as punishment for their sins. You're seeing the imaginal, the interior view of their soul as they suffered from the thing that is itself the sin. They have no control. They're blown about in darkness by these winds of their passions. And so it kind of brings us back to free your mind. Your ass will follow. Because only when people have been moved off their center and they pursue these things that have no reality do they become manipulable. And at that point, they become cattle, chattel, capital. The last piece I'll leave you with before I turn it over to you is these signs of rulership. Look at the ancient Greek world. And this is from my own research, not from any book I read. The pharaoh is shown with a crook and flail. The crook is the shepherd's crook. That gets used to hook a sheep's leg and drag that bitch backwards so it doesn't go running off. It says, come. It pulls, right? It restrains. What's the other one? A flail. Use that to whip them onwards. Now, the ancient Egyptians loved this symbol, but among the ancient Indo-Europeans, and you find it everywhere, there is the idea of the crook and flail. They become one symbol, and they're unified. They are unified most beautifully in the example of the Indian ankus, which is the elephant goad. It has a spike, and it has a hook, and it's shown as a sign of kingship, because the spike can be used to prod, to stimulate. Of course, the word stimulus in Latin just means cattle goad. So when anyone says stimulate, you know that they mean stick a cattle goad in them, right? Yet we've combined this sign with the spike and the hook. Now, there are variants where you have two hooks coming off and a spike in the center. And that is one of the secrets for those who still foolishly believe that the fleur-de-lis represents a lily. It's a sign of kingship, rulership over the chattel of the king that are controlled with this rod of rulership, which goes back to the idea of the thing that the shepherd or cattleman uses to control, to say yes and no, like the crook and flail of the Egyptians. We see it with rings that indicate a bond, right? Those are the rings that go with tack harness, traction systems, and binding up livestock. The belt of kingship and the ritual of cincture, of girding, is actually the straps and traction systems that go on animals. Even the fucking crown is a ring that has to do with binding and control, which reveals the secret that the king himself is a kind of slave in a reciprocal bond with his subjects. And all of this goes back to the idea of subject and predicate. To subject is to place them beneath the yoke. But the method of making a subject is to predicate something about it. Predicare, to speak out openly about its features. Well, you make something subject by establishing a predicate, a thing said about it, which means you make it subject by placing a mark upon it. The mark is the predicate. The thing that bears the mark becomes thereby the subject for the mark maker, or so it seems to me.
I think you're 100% right about that. I'm really, really glad that you covered that ground because I was hoping you would. That is exactly true. The signs, the symbolisms, the words that we use, we rarely think about these. And it is a form of, and I haven't gone too deep into this, although I have touched on this for some of my viewers, is that there is a very deep magical aspect to the human experience and human history as well. You could really tie that into Carl Jung's ideas or Freud's ideas about the signs and symbols and the words that we use and how these collectively come about. We even have this thing with mimetics these days as well, where we're tying in so many of these things and changing to some degree the ideas and the, as I think you termed it earlier on, the imaginal relationships we have to these signs and symbols and what they produce in essence as an end result. And we rarely ever think about that. It's a form of sorcery, put simply. Now, the word sorcery comes from the old French. I'm sure you're familiar with this. It comes from the old French sorcière, which means one who is able to manipulate or control his or her own fate. So in a very real sense, the people that we would and this is just a term we apply to them, sometimes derogatorily, but the power elite, as it were, are more than aware of these things. They are very, very clued up on these facts, and they are facts. They can be verified through time, through history, through logic, through rationality. So, bringing it back to what we were talking about in terms of human beings as chattel, they become very easy to control and manipulate as a result because they're not willing. See, this is part of the problem with human beings right now, is that they are willing slaves, as you pointed out. That's absolutely correct. This is one of the great problems. And in a sense, there's no point in people like me getting riled up about it, because it may well be the case that they are, and I hate to sound deterministic about this, but it may well be the case that they're not capable of breaking out of that. That's the thing that scares me. What if these people can't break out of that? What if they can't go to the extremes of going beyond their own bubbles and their own solipsistic belief systems? If they're stuck with that, and if biologically, deterministically, although I don't believe this is 100% the case, I think, personally speaking, this is just a personal belief of mine, but I think people can break out of that if they're taught well enough. And that brings me to another quick point. I'm darting between things in our chat here, but the education system. It's not an education system. It's an indoctrination system, as I've pointed out many times, right? I've read the works of John Gatto and Charlotte Iserbyt, and I would strongly encourage other people to read those works themselves. These are experts in the field of education, and they've worked in education, and they've served on various boards. And they've pointed out this fact, that it is in fact an indoctrination system. Kids aren't learning anything. How is it possible that kids graduate from school without basic language and math skills? And yet that's happening. Now, if we can't even teach them the basics of operating in this false reality, this false world that they're living in, what chance or what hope have they got of even wanting to reach beyond that? Now, again, I'm not suggesting everyone can, but one of the things that I've been toying with as an idea is the possibility that these power brokers in society, perhaps they are biologically different, just like you and I in some regards are biologically wired to be the way we are. We are the outliers in a real sense. We don't fit into society because we are actually beyond it's not even a bell curve, but the distribution curve of intelligence, let's say, which is a one way of measuring something, although I don't believe in that being the be all and end all. Right. But it's a good predictor of the capabilities of people in their thinking capacities. So that distribution curve seems to be you have an extremely small number of people on one side of it who are below average intelligence, and you have an extremely low number of people that are on the other side of it with extraordinarily high levels of intelligence. And in between, you have people that sort of are basically mediocre and average in their ability to think. So it's entirely possible that the people who have ended up with power through the centuries and millennia, unfortunately, from my perspective, may well be biologically gifted to be that way.
Or had an ancestor that was.
Yes, exactly. I mean, it's arguable whether today's power elites actually know quite as much as their ancestors did, to be perfectly honest, because if you look at the majority of them, they don't seem to have the first clue about how to run the economic spheres that they control or the political spheres that they control, which is perhaps one of the reasons why everything seems to be a bit of a shambles. We've got incompetent people running things at this point in time, but those that have competence or had competence previously must have distinguished themselves in some way to have done that, to have achieved this status, and obviously their lineage maintained that. And as you pointed out, this is why we have all these systems, these institutions and everything else, where people willingly become part of that. That's the most shocking thing, I think, is that so many people don't want to know.
And that
they literally...
that, if I may insert this, there is this idea that Aristotle had, which is the idea of natural slavery. And he's taken a lot of hits, as you would imagine, in the current day, for having proposed this notion. And I think that people fail to understand, perhaps, what he really meant by that. Because he discusses natural slavery. He says that they're basically people who by their nature are slaves. And the way that that is interpreted is that, well, essentially Aristotle is saying that some people shouldn't be anything more than slaves. So it's okay for us to use them that way. But people don't realize that he also says that essentially it's a bad idea to make someone a slave who doesn't want to be, because then that would require force, and the imposition of that force and violence would generate enmity. So immediately I have kind of a disconnect there. I'm like, well, if he was saying that it's all right and you should do it that way, why would he turn around and say, don't make anyone a slave who doesn't want to be? And I think it all comes back around. They're reading this idea of the natural slave as presented by Aristotle, I think, incorrectly. I think the idea is fundamentally that they are by their nature slaves, in the sense that that's what they are, that's what they be, that's what they do. There's no need to make of them slaves. That's the point of natural slaves. They will gravitate to that state of their own accord. Mm-hmm. And while, I think that all human beings, and I have to, this is my first principle, is the idea that all humans have the power, at least in potentia, in potential, to individuate. That's one of the reasons why I don't go in for the racial shit of the alt-right. It would force me to have to step away from the ultimate first principle, which is that when confronted by an individual, a true individual, I can throw away every single stereotype, because there's no telling what you're going to get. It's the glorious question mark that you may have this individual person that would cause you to entirely have to reframe every assumption, every generalization about whatever class or category that you wish to apply. But the issue, I think, is fundamentally they misunderstand natural slavery, which is that most people are too lazy, cowardly, or just, what's that? Can't remember the Latin for it, but it's the sin of sloth. Mind you, I'm not saying that, I'm buying into the Christian worldview, but I find it as useful as an interpretive grill, a hermeneutic filter, as any other mythos and ethos. And I think there's just ultimately the sin of sloth, the sin of not being really interested in finding out more. As long as the nipple fits into the mouth, right? or the penis fits into the PlayStation. I'm waiting for them to come up with some sort of, plastic device like that. And, no one will ever leave home. It'll almost be good enough, as good as, some sort of magical yoga that will allow you to give yourself a blowjob.
My friend was recently telling me, a friend of mine and I were talking about exactly this, and he was mentioning the fact that the Japanese have created these sex robots now. So, the civilization's just going into some very strange
civilization. Yes.
Yeah.
But let me say this: we're past an hour, which means that I will need to probably split this clip into two, because I find that my viewers generally won't come around if the length of the clip looks too long. I think all the content is great, so I'm perfectly happy to split it into two, but I would need to wrap the discussion portion of this by an hour and 20 minutes. So I wonder if I could turn it back over to you to wrap this up, or
sure,
give your thoughts on some of the ground that we've covered, because I've been running my mouth quite a bit.
No, not at all. I think we both have, in some regards. We had quite a lot to say to each other for the first time of chatting, and a lot of ideas get exchanged, and that's a healthy thing. So, in closing, what I would say is that human beings need to do better as a species. Quite frankly, we're a fucking disappointment in a great many ways, right? This is one of the things that we are grappling with, is that there aren't enough people, as I think both of us basically have said, that have studied their own place in the world and where they belong or who they are. They don't have a true, authentic sense of themselves. That's completely gone now. What you have are accepted dogmas in people. They are, as you said, collectivized in some regards. They don't have a sense of individuality. They can't individuate themselves from the herd. And when you reach that level, that's the point at which you get these tyrannies that we are seeing. That's the great difficulty for human civilization through the ages, is that we do descend into tyranny when not enough people individuate. It doesn't have to be the entire population, but you need a certain bulk of it to become self-aware. And I guess that's where I'll kind of end it for this portion, man, because that's what I think we need to do. We need to better ourselves. That's the first place you start, is with yourself as an individual, and you work on yourself as hard as you can to understand yourself, and then go beyond that to maybe helping others a little bit as well.
I guess the closing phrase I'll throw in two. One is from Voltaire, who suggests that we all cultivate our own garden. And the second is Parliament Funkadelic, and that is free your mind, your ass will follow.